You're listening to A Mighty Fortress.
Hello and welcome to A Mighty Fortress. I am your host, Knight Jake Zabel. On today's episode, I'm going to be introducing a new segment. This is called Bible Book in Minutes. In this segment, we'll go through the different books of the Bible. I intend to have one episode for all 66 books of the Bible, so there'll be 66 separate episodes. I'd like to do them all separately instead of trying to just cram them all together. This segment is Bible Book in Minutes, so that's Bible Book X in X amount of minutes. So this is like Genesis in 36 minutes, or the Gospel of John in 68 minutes, or something like that. So in today's episode, I've got John Kleinig coming in to help us go through the book of Leviticus, and I've already got this recorded, and the clock will start now. So welcome to Leviticus in 65 minutes. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. The grace of the Lord Jesus be with God's people. Amen. Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Jake Zabel. Joined with me today is the Rev Dr John Kleinig to help us go through the book of Leviticus, which he has written a commentary on for the Concordia Bible Commentary Series, which is available from CPH.
Okay, Leviticus is probably the one Cinderella book in the Old Testament. It's interesting, back in the 50s and 60s, the Reader's Digest did condensed version of classical texts.
Okay.
And it did a condensed version of the Bible. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, it omitted Leviticus altogether. Not a single part of it.
Was there other books admitted, or?
Not entirely. There were some parts, I think. Some of the small ones maybe, but no major one was omitted entirely.
Okay.
And partly because there's very little story there. Mm. But even more telling, the lectionary, the series of readings that we have in our churches, the 3-year lectionary, mm-hmm. was expanded from 1 year to 3 year to include more of the Bible. And not just New Testament, but Old Testament. Yeah. And in the Sundays after Pentecost, you get 2 readings to try and include more of the Bible. But it's interesting, there's only, in that 3-year lectionary, there's only 2 readings from Leviticus.
Do you know what the readings they are?
Yeah, it's from Leviticus chapter 19, mm-hmm. about holiness. And even then, there's
both of them?
Both of them, yes.
Okay.
And loving your neighbour as yourself, that's where that comes from. Oh. Okay. But even, it's very little. Apart from that, nothing. And that's not always the case. There's probably more commentaries on Leviticus in the early church than most other books of the Old Testament. Okay. Say, apart from Psalms and Isaiah, maybe Genesis too, but Leviticus was very important in the early church. Mm. And in fact, as far as Jews are concerned, it is the most important one. Mm. It's the centre of the Pentateuch, mm-hmm. and the Pentateuch is the core of Old Testament. Yep. So for Jews, at the present time, Leviticus is the most important part of the Bible. Mm-hmm. For Jews, they don't have a New Testament, but their New Testament is the Mishnah, yep. The commentary on the law of mm-hmm. Moses, the Pentateuch, and most of it has to do with the interpretation and application of Leviticus for a new situation where you no longer have a temple and sacrifices.
Okay, yep.
So it's the Jewish equivalent to the New Testament, and its focuses largely on Leviticus. It's important for Jews, but basically it's neglected by Christians, mm-hmm. and the neglect is not just accidental because it's not very interesting or it's irrelevant. I'd say it's very relevant, not irrelevant, but it deals with 3 topics that are very unfashionable. Yep. And that have basically almost disappeared from the church. It has to do with worship. And you won't make sense of it said the whole book is a book about worship, the divine service. Mm-hmm. And not just worship generally, a general theology of worship, but it's in this book God institutes worship. by his word, and then also establishes how people live lives that are consistent with their worship.
Mm-hmm.
So because of neglect of worship, or particular kind of worship, because we don't mind talking about worship as praise singing, but not as ritual. And modern people don't like ritual. Leviticus is all ritual, therefore it's irrelevant.
Okay.
The second reason is that you won't make sense of it unless you understand that it has to do with God's holiness.
Yeah.
A theology of holiness. And it's interesting how that's disappeared from the church. Interest in holiness and understanding of holiness. Still remember some years ago I met with a student who I taught here in Adelaide, who went on to America to do a master's there from New Guinea. And when I visited New Guinea and caught up with him, and he then asked him how things went with him in America, he paused a long time and he said, "John, for them nothing is sacred any longer." And that's the problem. For us, we live in a society where nothing is sacred any longer, at least nothing that God says is sacred any longer. We have other things that we regard as being sacred, but not the divine service and not the holy things of God. And the third reason is that it has to do with something that we get rather uncomfortable with, and it's the emphasis on atonement and blood. There's a lot of bloody business. Sacrificial blood, sacrifices generally, but then particularly atonement through the blood of sacrifices, basically modern people are most uncomfortable with.
Yes, I've noticed a lot with the current church, the idea of the atonement through the sacrifice is something that a lot of people just shy away from and don't want to touch. Forensic justification is one thing that gets a nice rejection and whipping these days, because
it's connected with, you won't understand it in the biblical sense unless you see it's closely connected with the atonement. It's because of Christ's atoning death, therefore that's the basis of justification before blood. The blood justifies us. That's New Testament. So there's reasons why it's unfashionable, but also I think it's a book that's waiting to be rediscovered, and I think it'll be a while before it's rediscovered in the West, like Australia. It's very, very valuable and helpful on the mission field, where all this makes perfect sense. But sadly, on a lot of the Western missionaries that came there, the last part of the Bible they translated was Leviticus, if it's translated at all. And yet when it is translated, the reaction seems to be, why haven't we heard this before? Because it makes such good sense to us. Yeah, I think too, so it's a very important book for the mission of the church, and I suspect also for the mission of the church in Australia. And if I can just do a little bit of a diversion, a lot of young people particularly feel that in some way we have the ecological movement, and interest in pollution. That's one of the dominant metaphors that govern people's behaviour and thinking in our modern society. It's not just, and it's interesting the way it's infiltrated everywhere. The basic thing was that the natural order, the natural world has been polluted by us human beings, destroying the ecological order. And that then the result of that is that people themselves feel that there's certain things that pollute them, make them unclean. And so you have an obsession with food, certain types of food and certain types of activity which make you unclean. And one of the dominant senses that I have, that younger people seem to have, is somehow they are unworthy, they are ashamed of themselves because they are unclean, polluted. And they don't know what to do with this sense of pollution, and so they try and pursue health by means of exercise and diet and all sorts of other ways of dealing with this sense of being unclean.
And meditation.
Meditation, the whole Eastern spiel is built around that sense of uncleanness and an unclean conscience. Not unclean body, unclean mind, unclean conscience. And this is particularly so as a result of the sexual revolution. Instead of liberating people sexually, it's mucked them up. And they feel increasingly people who indulge themselves in all forms of sex become disgusted with sex.
Mm.
And instead of giving them fulfillment, it makes them feel dirty,
Yeah.
soiled, unclean. That then comes back and bites them because they can't enjoy sex anymore because it makes them feel dirty, unclean, unworthy. Okay, so it's a book I think that has potentially a lot to say to people if they're prepared to do the hard work on it.
Yep.
It's not an easy book because it's almost all has to do with ritual.
Mm.
But it means it's not theoretical, it's very, very practical. Okay, let me say a few things generally about the book. Now, we say the Bible is the Word of God, and that's right, but of all the books in the Bible, the book of Leviticus has more divine speech than any other book. You say that again? It has more passages which are the words of God, and are quoted as the words of God. In fact, we have in Leviticus very clearly delineated 36 separate speeches through the book. They're carefully graded, and it's interesting just to look at the speeches. So if you look at, for example, just to go right at the beginning, Leviticus 1 verse 1, the Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. Speak to the people of Israel and say to them. So you have a word here that's given from God to Moses that he's to the people. So you get that chain of transmission. Mm-hmm. Most commonly, they are speeches of God that are addressed to Moses. Mm-hmm. There are some speeches that are addressed to Moses and Aaron. There's 4 of them.
Yep.
And then there's one which is exceptional, which is spoken only to Aaron. Okay. I want to come back to that. So, just if you read it, that sticks out like a sore thumb. Mm. So, mostly God speaks to Moses. A few times he speaks to Moses and Aaron, and then sometimes he speaks just to Aaron. And then of the speeches to Moses, there's only a few that have to do with Moses, so only 9 which are then not only spoken to Moses, but are for Moses. Yeah. Half of them, it's interesting, there's a lot of numbers being played around with. Mm-hmm. 18 out of the 36 are given to Moses to give to the Israelites.
Yeah.
Now, this is very important because a lot of people, when they come to Leviticus saying, oh, this is rather irrelevant, it only has to do with the priests. In fact, most of them is not addressed to the priests, but the people. Mm-hmm. So half of them in all are addressed to the people of Israel and have to do with their involvement in the divine service. There's only 4 that are addressed to the priests. Mm-hmm. That's rather odd because it looks as if it's terribly priestly, but there's only 4 out of the 36 that are addressed to the priests. And 2 that are addressed to Aaron through Moses. So you have 36 speeches, and they all have to do with the topic is the divine service. Yep. And the involvement of Israelites in the divine service. And there's 2 sides to their involvement. There's their involvement directly, their participation in the divine service, but then there's also the way their participation in divine service affects their whole way of life, and the way their whole way of life is drawn into their worship. So basically it has to do life and worship and the interface between them. Okay, so it has to do with God speaking. 36 speeches. And it's interesting that this is set in a broader context, so in a narrative context. So it's part of the whole story in the Pentateuch, beginning with creation, the call of Abraham, stories of Isaac, Jacob, Israel and Egypt, and then you get the rescue from Egypt, God bringing his people to Mount Sinai, and God making a covenant with his people at Mount Sinai. That's the end of Exodus. And Exodus ends with the story that God instituted the daily service, and he also instituted the tabernacle and the priesthood. Right? And then the last part of Exodus deals with the building of the tabernacle and the consecration of the tabernacle with holy anointing oil, and the bringing of the ark into the Holy of Holies, and the glory of God leaving the place where it was previously, which is the top of Mount Sinai. That's God's glory, is his presence. And this is very significant for Leviticus. Exodus ends with the glory of God leaving the top of Mount Sinai and going into the Holy of Holies. And then the glory is contained in a cloud, so the glory is in the Holy of Holies, and the cloud covers the whole tabernacle. There's 2 other things that haven't been done yet. God hasn't instituted the way ordinary people are involved in the divine service. The first divine service hasn't been enacted yet, inaugurated. The priests haven't been consecrated. They haven't been ordained. So this picks up the story then, after God's glory had left the top of Mount Sinai and had gone into the Holy of Holies. And this means then the place where God meets with Moses and Moses meets with God changes.
Yeah.
Instead of it being the top of the mountain, it now becomes the tabernacle. And the tabernacle was two parts. There was the Holy of Holies and the holy place.
Yep.
The place where God met with Moses was the holy place. You have the Holy of Holies, where you have the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat, the cherubim. And then you have the holy place, where you have the incense altar. You have the candlesticks, the 7 lamps, and then the table for showbread.
Yep.
Now that's where Moses goes to receive God's word.
Into the holy place or the holy of holies?
No, just the holy place.
Yep.
That outer room. And so look at the way the book begins. Moses doesn't barge. There's the Holy of Holies and there's the holy place. Everybody's scared to go in because it's dangerous to come into God's room.
You get smite down.
You get zapped. And then notice how then the story begins at the beginning of Leviticus. The Lord called Moses. Right? He doesn't go in by himself, he comes at the call of God.
Yeah.
The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying... So the place for revelation is the tent of meeting. And it's called the tent of meeting because this is the place where God meets with Moses, and then later on he meets with the high priest and meets with the priest on duty. The altar outside is God's place of meeting with the people.
Okay, yeah.
Right? So you have two places of meeting. There's the place of meeting first with Moses, then with Aaron, and then after Aaron the high priest and the priest on duty. Then in the daily service, God meets with his people out at the altar for burnt offering outside. So there's a narrative framework. So this picks up the story, and all the speeches are embedded in a story. So you have the beginning here in chapter 1, and then the story is picked up in chapter 8, 9 and 10. 8 tells of how Moses consecrated Aaron and all the priests, got them ready to officiate in the divine service. And then chapter 9 is like the most important part of the book of Leviticus, and it's probably in some ways the most important part of the Old Testament. It's the inauguration of the divine service. The divine service has there's other acts of worship before this, but this is the first time that the full divine service that God establishes in Exodus and then in the first part of Leviticus is enacted. And it's an amazing account because it tells how the full service was enacted for the first time, and the purpose of its enactment is for God's glory, which had been on top of Mount Sinai and then in the Holy of Holies, now appears to the people as fire on the altar for burnt offering. So the sacrifices are put on the altar, and then fire comes from the Holy of Holies and burns up the sacrifices. And that fire is never allowed to go out. It's the perpetual fire, it's the holy fire, it's the fire that makes the altar and all the offerings holy. In New Testament terms, the fire, New Testament is the Holy Spirit that consecrates everything. So this is the holy fire, and it's interesting that the fire, the whole order of the service is enacted, and I won't go through it, it's just too complicated. Yeah. But then at the end of it, once all the offerings have been laid on the altar, Moses and Aaron go in front of the altar and they bless the people with the Aaronic benediction. Right. And the moment they bless the people, fire comes from the Holy of Holies, burns up the offerings. And that's deeply significant because it's through the purpose of the divine service. The divine service has two purposes. One is for God to reveal himself, his presence, his glory. But it's not glory primarily in judgment, but it's glory in grace. So his gracious presence, his presence in order to bless the people. From this you can deduce, well, what's the purpose of the divine service? Is for God to bring his blessings from heaven to his people on earth. People come to the divine service to participate, to receive God's blessing. And you can see it's all summarised in the Aaronic benediction. But then immediately after, chapter 9, so it's narrative, chapter 9 is followed by chapter 10, which tells one of the most terrible incidents of many in Pentateuch.
That's the death of...
Nadab and Abihu. Nadab and Abihu are the oldest sons of Aaron, and they decide to do some creative Israelite worship. They take some censers and put incense on it, and they get fire, but not the fire from the altar. So it's not holy fire, but their own fire.
Okay.
And they come before God, and it's probably a bit. There's lots of gaps in the story, quite deliberately, but it seems that they went into the holy place where the altar for incense was, and they wanted to burn incense there before God. And the result of that is that God's wrath comes against them, and they lose their lives. Terrible incident, and for us, very inexplicable. Why should they forfeit their lives? They're doing something which there's not. What's wrong with burning incense? God commands the priests to do so, but they do the right thing, but in the wrong way. They don't use the holy fire, and therefore they lose their lives. And it's in connection with that little incident, and I'll come back to this in a moment, that you get the one speech that God addresses to Moses, and it has to do with distinguishing between what's clean and unclean, holy and common. Okay, I'll come back to that, because this is fundamental to understanding almost the whole of the book.
Yeah.
But let me tell the story. So that's where the story ends. And it begins then, Moses going to the holy place, receiving God's words. So all the speeches up to this are Moses in the holy place. He passes it on to the people, and then you have the consecration of the priests, followed by the inauguration of the divine service, followed by God's judgment on Nadab and Abihu for desecrating his holiness. The worst sin is to desecrate the most holy things.
Yeah.
No? And if you desecrate the most holy things, the judgment of God comes on you. Instead of receiving life and blessing, you receive death and God's curse. Then the story is picked up in chapter 16, which has to do with the Day of Atonement. And that follows directly on the story of Nadab and Abihu. It's to prevent this from happening again.
Yeah.
Right? And so every year, so immediately after that incident of Nadab and Abihu, God gives Moses and Aaron the regulations for the Day of Atonement, and what they did then is fixed up by the first celebration of the Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
So the Day of Atonement is to prevent the priests and the people from desecrating God's holiness.
Yeah. Okay.
Because if you come into God's presence in the wrong way or unclean, then God's presence won't be blessing to you, it'll bring judgment to you.
And that's probably, again, that similar to picked up in 1 Corinthians.
Absolutely.
Where we talk about those who eat and drink the body and blood of Christ in an unworthy manner, eat and drink judgment upon themselves.
Yeah,
and they're desecrating the holy things.
Not just the holy things, the most holy things.
The most holy things.
The most holy things, and that's what Paul says, that's why some of you are weak, some of you are sick, and some have died. They are the grades of desecration. So for minor acts of desecration, sickness, more severe desecration, ill health, and where you desecrate the most holy things, it's death.
As in the case of
Nadab and Abihu, that's the case of that last one. Yeah, so it carries over to the New Testament and helps to explain passages there that don't otherwise make sense for modern people.
Which is again why you said Leviticus is a very important book, because it helps us to understand things in the New Testament that otherwise
are just shut. And particularly things to do with worship. And Holy Communion, baptism even. You have the narrative framework. The third part of the narrative is about the Day of Atonement, and then the last part of the narrative is in chapter 24, which is another act of sacrilege. The story is about how a man who had an Israelite mother but a pagan father who fights together with an Israelite. They go into a battle, and then he curses God. He abuses the most holy name. The only most holy thing that the ordinary Israelites had at their disposal was the holy name Yahweh, the Lord. And he uses that to curse the Lord. A terrible act of sacrilege. the result of that is that he is excommunicated from the community and put to death.
He blasphemed the name.
He blasphemes the name. He doesn't just use the name to blaspheme or to curse somebody. That's bad enough. But he blasphemes God himself. Curses God. A terrible act of sacrilege, having to do with the second commandment. You shall not take the name of Yahweh, the most holy name, in vain. And then you have, the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. So you have that narrative framework, and then the book ends, and then the story is picked up when Moses comes to in Numbers, and then it continues at Mount Sinai before the Israelites leave Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
But I won't continue it. So you have this narrative framework.
This was, I was just looking back there, we were talking about the story of the blasphemer.
Yes, that's 24.
Verse 16 there.
Yes.
The sojourner as well as the native, when they blaspheme, shall be put to death.
Yes.
So that's interesting that it includes the law there is to both the native Israelites and
the foreigners who live in their midst, who are allowed to participate in parts of the worship. So they aren't automatically excluded from worship. It's not just the Israelites, but also anybody who's resident within the community. Now, that's the basic framework, so you get the narrative framework. At the centre of the book lies the Day of Atonement.
Yep.
That's the pivot, chapter 16. But then you get 2 blocks of material, of speeches, before that. So the first block, which is chapters 1 to 7, has to do with the offerings of the people. 1 to 7, and it has looked at from 2 points of view. One is from what the priests are to do with their offerings. So this is not the nation's offering, but it's the offerings that families, people bring to God. And there are 3 or 4, 5 classes of offerings. There's the burnt offering, there's the grain offering, and then there is the peace offering. And then they are the regular ones, and then in case of sin, you have the sin offering, and in case of minor acts of desecration, the guilt offering. So you have the 5 different classes of offerings, each with their different function. They don't do the same thing, they have different function. The offerings that you bring to God, but for ordinary people, the most important part of the offerings is not what they give to God, but the holy food that they have. So they bring, say, bread or grain to God, flour. Part of it's given to God, the rest they eat as holy food, like as in Holy Communion.
Okay.
It's a holy meal.
Just the priests or the people as well?
The priests and the people.
Okay.
So so 1 through to 5 deals with the offerings, the various classes of offerings. Then chapter 6 and 7 deals with what you do with the things that are left over that aren't burnt on the altar.
Yeah.
Right? So it's the eating of the holy food. And the fact that you need to be in a state of ritual purity, eat the holy food. And that points to the fact, something that modern readers don't realise but was taken for granted. So what we don't realise is that the Israelites brought offerings to God not in order to provide food for God. A little bit was given to God, but he gave the rest back to them as holy food for them to eat, and also wine to drink. So he was the host, they were his guests, they ate the holy food that came from his altar, from his table. So, and that's what chapters 6 and 7 have to do with.
And that's followed in with the New Testament. Right?
Yes, with Holy Communion. Yeah, which is likewise a holy banquet. We don't just eat ordinary food, common food, but we eat holy food.
Yeah.
Or even more than that, ordinary people ate holy food. The priests ate most holy food. Holy food brought blessing. Most holy food made you holy and kept you holy.
Yeah.
So some of the food was eaten by the priests, and made them holy. Most of what the lay people brought, they ate, was holy food. They ate for God to give them holy food, to bless them, and to give them joy in His presence. That's the chapters before the ordination of the priests and the divine service, and the incident of the sacrilege with Nadab and Abihu.
Yep.
Then after chapter 10, you get chapters 11 through to chapter 15, which deal with purity. They are regulations for what makes you ritually unclean, and therefore disqualifies you from participating in the divine service, disqualifies you from eating holy food and drinking holy wine. They deal with the most common forms of impurity. Impurity that comes from eating the wrong kind of meat, meat from animals that you can't offer to God, unclean meat. The impurity that comes as a result of childbirth, that's chapter 12. The impurity that comes from skin diseases, we could say leprosy, it's really broader than that. And then the impurity that comes from mildew in houses. They were houses that were made of clay and straw, and therefore are prone to mildew and were very dangerous because they infected people then with ill health. So unclean houses, and then sexual impurity. A sexual impurity which came from irregular sexual discharges. So you have the menstrual bleeding of women in the menstrual cycle, made her and anything that was affected by unclean. It wasn't just the menstrual bleeding, but any irregular form of bleeding, not just menstrual. So any irregular sexual discharge, any irregular discharge from the uterus. But also then it's for men, is equally important, any irregular discharge of either semen or anything else from penis. So it has to do with the uncleanness that came from this. And the purpose of these laws then is to show the Israelites what they needed to be cleansed for when they came to the service, what they needed to do so that they would be qualified to enjoy the divine service. So the purpose is stated in chapter 15, verse 31. Thus, this is a summary statement, thus you shall keep the people of Israel separate from their uncleanness, lest they die in their uncleanness by defiling my tabernacle that's in the midst. Uncleanness in itself is not the problem, but if you're unclean and you come to God's presence, you desecrate his holiness. And that's where the trouble starts. So you separate the uncleanness and keep it away from the tabernacle. Keep it outside the divine service. So that's the second block of material.
With the uncleanness, I've heard many people talk about the purposes behind the uncleanness, where they'll talk about like the actual health benefits of keeping these laws, so the physical sense. What's your opinions on that?
There's a limited truth to that, but most of it has to do with the occult. So there were certain types of animals which were sacred to certain gods. So take, for example, say a pig was sacred to the gods of the underworld. Okay, and the gods of the underworld, bad spirits, evil spirits, demons. Or take, for example, menstrual blood, is used not only in the ancient world, but still in many countries for magic purposes. Or men would have sexual intercourse with women while they were menstruating so that they would get supernatural life power from the woman. Men would use semen to perform magic. They'd eat, in homosexual acts, they would drink semen, not as a sexual act, but for spiritual purposes to get supernatural power, occult power, spiritual power. So each in their own way has to do with not just ill health, but the question of death, that which brings death to human beings, physically but also spiritually. And quite a number of them then have to do with the occult. It's not just for moral reasons, but for spiritual reasons. Going, if you like, in ways that we understand, going into paganism, going into the occult, opening the door to the occult. Or another case which is not here in these chapters is contact with corpses. For pagan people, the spirits of a dead person are most holy, and the remains of a person who's died are holy. All that kind of stuff. So if you say that contact with the dead is unclean, you cut off the taproot of animism and any form of, not just necromancy, the conjuring up of spirits, but the whole occult basically is built up on contacts with spirits. And all of these laws on purity have to do with stopping people from going into the occult, dealing with evil spirits. In fact, one of the most evil things that Israelites can do is to either practice sorcery, witchcraft, or to be involved in the practice of witchcraft. So that's two big blocks of teaching. And then chapter 16, you have the Day of Atonement. And then immediately after that, you have a whole chapter on blood and how God, and this also you won't make sense of that unless you see that for animist people, blood is the one substance that is both earthly and heavenly. It's both physical and spiritual. It's the link between the two worlds, the spirit world and the human world. And you then can get spirit power through blood. And all pagan religions, in animist pagan religions, all the most important ceremonies have to do with blood. Magic's done with blood, healing's done with blood, etc. The blood is used for many purposes. Now, God says, prevents the Israelites from drinking blood, which for pagan people was the most important part, because if you drink the blood of an animal, you get that animal's life power.
Is there in Genesis as well when?
That's in with Noah. That's
Noah.
when the prohibition or first prohibition of drinking blood. It occurs in a number of places, but in chapter 17, you get a whole chapter which deals with prohibits the wrong use of blood, the use of blood for occult purposes, and restricts the use of blood of a sacrificed animal for atonement. That blood is to be put on the altar in a rite of atonement. So if you think of atonement, you think of blood that's placed on the altar, blood which cleanses people from impurity rather than making them unclean, blood which forgives their sins and frees them from impurity, blood which brings about forgiveness or release from sin. You get that in New Testament, the blood of Jesus Christ his Son cleanses us. So there's a whole chapter, chapter 17, on blood. And it comes immediately after the Day of Atonement, because atonement has to do with blood. The only way you can do atonement is through the blood of an animal that has been sacrificed to God. Very, very important use of blood. Then chapter 18.
There's mention of Azazel.
Azazel, yes. It's, you send there's two goats. There's the scapegoat. There's the scapegoat that you confess all the sins over. One of the goats is sacrificed as a sin offering. The other one, all the sins of the Israelites are put on Azazel, and he's sent out to the desert where he's pushed over a cliff. Now, there's a lot of speculation, particularly in already before later Judaism about Azazel, and the agreement is that it's an evil spirit, so, or if not Satan. So you send, you send sins and impurity to where it belongs. It belongs not here on earth, but it belongs with Satan. Yeah.
Do you know what the Hebrew word there means?
There's a number of things together, but it doesn't help at all.
Okay.
The first part of the book deals with sacrifices and then with purity of the people. From here onwards, initially now, the next chapter, chapter 18, is the last chapter that deals with purity, because it has to do with sexual purity. That any improper form of sexual intercourse or interaction outside of marriage, and homosexual or lesbian intercourse, any form of intercourse with animals, any form of intercourse with relatives is forbidden. Why? Because it destroys the life of the family and makes people unclean. If you have a look at chapter 18, verse 24, do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, any of these wrong sexual practices. For by these the nations, that's the pagan nations, I'm driving out before you, have become unclean, and the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. Sexual malpractices don't only contaminate the family, and people in the family, and contaminate them as believers, but they contaminate the whole land. Now, the land needs to be kept clean because God's presence is in the land. So that's two reasons. One, notice that right at the beginning, these ordinances are life-giving ordinances. So if you go to chapter 18, verse 5, you shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules as follows. If a person does them, he shall live by them. He shall have life by them. If a person is ha'adam, meaning a human being. So this is not just for Israelites.
Yep.
So sexual malpractice is life-destroying. You know, we think that if we get involved in these kinds of sex, we have a fuller life, a better life, but it's suicidal. It destroys life. And contained in this also there's the sacrifice, and this kind of stands out a bit. So this has to do with uncleanness, of sexual uncleanness. And then comes chapter 19, which has to do with holiness. How do the people of Israel, who have been made clean from their impurity and made holy by means of the divine service, they share in God's holiness, how then are they to live as holy people? So these are regulations which prevent people from desecrating, the Israelites from desecrating their holiness. So it doesn't have to do with the pagan people, it has to do with God's holy people. Protect them physically and sexually. Yeah, you see, why do people get involved in, become promiscuous and so on? It's because they think, I'll be able to live life more fully and enjoy life. Won't have a boring life, but I'll have a fuller life. I'll find sexual fulfillment, and then sexual fulfillment leads to fulfillment in life. But, I mean, I've lived through the sexual revolution and seen how much of a con it is. It promises life, but all it does is delivers death of various kinds. It kills more, it doesn't create, it's not life-giving, it's life-denying, it's life-destroying. And you can see that happening all around you in terms of broken marriages and then the sexual chaos that we have. Okay, these regulations are not to deprive us of the enjoyment of life, but to make the enjoyment of life possible. It's not to deprive us of sexual enjoyment, but to make sexual enjoyment possible, if I can put it that way. And so chapter 18, this applies to all human beings, not just Israelites. But then chapter 20 deals with covers the same things, but from a different angle, from the Israelites, and saying that they are to keep themselves sexually clean, pure, so that they don't desecrate God's holiness. So it has to do with holiness. The key verse there is in chapter 20, 7 and 8. God says, okay, and he includes not only the sexual practices, but two other things which have to do with the occult. One is sacrificing children to Moloch, who's a god of the underworld. So you sacrifice your children, like we do with abortion, to have a better life. So if I give a child, my oldest child, to Moloch, then I will get many other children. Moloch has to do with fertility, family fertility. So you get the sacrifice of children to the god of the underworld, evil spirits, so that you will get life, a better life. It's not only for your own fertility, but the Israelites were agricultural people. If they did this would make their fields and their flocks more fertile.
And that was an interesting connection they should make with like the issue of abortion now.
It is,
is they're sacrificing another person's life
for
to make their own life better.
To enhance their own life. To have a better life for themselves. So they sacrifice a child so that they have a better life for themselves. Then also you get in verse 6 and verse 27, there's prohibition of involvement in any form of the occult and occult practitioners, whether they are mediums or necromancers or whatever the case may be. Okay. Once again, the promise there is of getting not just ordinary power, but supernatural life power. I'll be more powerful, I'll be more alive, but it desecrates God's holiness. So, but then the key verses are verse 7 and 8, and then verse 26. Verse 7, consecrate yourselves therefore and be holy, I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourselves, be holy. I'll come back to those things there. Keep my statutes and do them. I'm the Lord who sanctifies you. God makes and keeps his people holy. They are to consecrate themselves by keeping God's statutes. God gives through his word, establishes the means by which he makes and keeps them holy. So he establishes the divine service and the sacrifices, so that by their participation in the divine service, God shares his holiness with them. Mm-hmm. How do they consecrate themselves? By doing what God gives them to do. It's by participation in worship. So God makes us holy. He makes us holy through word and sacrament. By going to church, we do those things by which God makes and keeps us holy, and therefore we are holy. We become holy, we remain holy. End of the chapter. You shall be holy to me, for I the Lord am holy, and have separated you from the peoples, that's unbelieving peoples, that you may be mine. So you have chapter 18 dealing with sexual purity, which is the presupposition for sanctifying sex. That's verse 20, chapter 20, and between that you get the holiness of the Israelites. So 18 through to 20 deals with the holiness of lay Israelites. Chapter 21 and 22 deals with the holiness of the priests, how they share in God's holiness. And then chapter 23 deals with holy times. Because what God establishes is not just a holy place, or a holy priesthood, or a holy service, but he also establishes holy times, times in which he comes to meet with his people to make and keep them holy. Times when he comes to his people to meet with them to give them his blessing. So you have a whole calendar there, if you take a liturgical calendar, beginning with the Sabbath day, which is the regular weekly one, new moon days, and then all the other festivals. Then at the beginning of chapter 24, you get two holy things, the holy lamps and the holy oil, and then the holy showbread that's put on the table. Then in chapter 25, you get the regulation about the sabbatical year and the Jubilee year. So just as the Israelites are to rest one day a week, the land, they are to give rest to people and the land every 7 years. And then every 50 years, 49 years, you have a whole Jubilee year in which both the land and the people are given. There's atonement for the whole land, and there is rest for the land. Then comes the climax of the book. And the climax of the book comes in chapter 26 with blessings and curses. Okay, God says, the following things will happen if you worship me in the right way. If you keep my Sabbaths, if you respect my sanctuary and all the services, then you'll have blessings. And the blessings are wonderful. They're outlined there in chapter 26, verse 3 through to 13. And then you get a whole list of curses if you don't worship God as he requires. If you defile his holiness and desecrate his holiness, then God's curses will come on you. But it ends even with a remarkable statement. Even if you desecrate the worship, it doesn't mean the end of the story. God's covenant still stands. They can repent and come back, and then if they return, they will receive God's blessings once again. Now, I could spend an hour just going through it. But it's best if you people who are listening look at it yourself and read it through. I just want to focus on one part of this. That's the 4 main blessings of the Israelites who worship God in the way that he has commanded. So it said, if you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, the statutes and commandments have to do with the divine service. If you worship God in the way that he has instituted, then you have the following 4 blessings. The first blessing, it's an agricultural community, is the blessing of rain. Regular rain, enough rain. You come from a farm, I come from a farm, you know that without rain, nothing grows. And the whole family, the nation suffers. So the first of the blessings that come from worshipping God in the right way is rain. Secondly, that there will be peace. Internal peace within the country and within the community, but also external peace. You won't have enemies, and if enemies attack you, you'll be protected. You will be able to defeat your enemies. So there's rain, there's peace and defence. Then comes family prosperity. That your families, instead of dying out, instead of having no children and the family dying out, the families will grow. But they won't grow too fast, and they won't grow in such a way that there won't be enough food to feed them. But so you'll have a growing family, and at the same time you'll have enough food to feed the growing family. So you have life within the family. The family doesn't die, the family grows. So it has to do with the family. So the first one, rain for livelihood. Second one, peace for safety. And the third one has to do with family life and family prosperity. But then comes the most surprising last blessing, which I'd like to read. This is verses 11 and 12. And God says, I will make my dwelling among you. I will live in the midst of you. That's the greatest blessing. Not something from God, but that God will live in their midst. So he himself is the blessing. And he goes on to add, now that could be a curse if he lived among them and he was angry with them and judged them. But he goes on to say, and I will not abhor you, my soul will not abhor you. And I will walk among you and will be your God, and you shall be my people. God will be in his midst. He won't abhor them. He will be committed to them. So the important thing is not their commitment to him, but his commitment to them. And since he's committed to them, they will be able to enjoy life as his people. I am the Lord, your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that you might not be slaves. And I've broken the bars of your yoke and made you to walk again. So the great blessing is God's two things. God's presence with his people, presence to bless them, to take care of them as their God, but then also to give them freedom. We talk about freedom of worship or freedom for worship. God gives his people freedom from worship. So as long as they worship God and he lives in their midst and cares for them, they will have freedom. They won't be slaves again. God doesn't want to turn them into be slaves, but he wants them to be his children, to care for them, so they can walk erect as free people in his presence. So enjoy living in God's presence and enjoy God's approval of them and God's blessing of them.
The one thing I find like again interesting there is verse 12, where it says, I will walk among you.
Yes.
That brings up the imagery back in Genesis, where God used to walk with Adam and Eve in the garden.
Okay, and this is quite intentionally, it's paradise, to a measure of paradise will be restored. And not in a new Garden of Eden, but through the divine service.
Yeah.
God's living with his people and walking with his people, walking among them, not abhorring them, not kicking them out of the garden as Adam and Eve were, not enslaving them so that they have to work for a living and be slaves to making a living, but to give them freedom to enjoy life in the presence of God, living with God. Then that's chapter 27, that's the climax. And then comes 26. Chapter 27 is a kind of appendix, which has to do with votive offerings and tithes. Offerings that you give to God because you promise to give God something, and what you're supposed to do with the tithes of your agricultural produce. Okay, that's the general outline of the book.
Yep.
The whole of the book has to do with worship, and it has to do with purity and holiness and blessing. And I want to home just finally in that. I said that there's only one speech in which God addresses Aaron.
Yep.
And this speech, in a sense, is the theological key to the whole book. So if you want to understand the theology of the book, the theology of worship that we have here, this is putting it in a nutshell. And he says this to Aaron, who is the chief priest, and through Aaron to all the other priests. What's the task of the priests? This is what God says. Chapter 10, verse 8 through to 11. The Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, do not drink wine or strong drink, you and your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, lest you die. Now, quite often, pagan priests used to drink alcohol
And get drunk.
Okay, this is prohibited entirely. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. But now, this is the key verse. You shall distinguish between holy and common, and between unclean and clean, and you shall teach the people of Israel all the statutes that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. Now, the task of the priests, not just theoretically, but practically, is to distinguish four things from each other. First of all, if I can go from the end, to distinguish what's unclean from what is clean. Now, anything that God created in itself is clean. So all food is clean because God created it. Sex is clean, God's created it. But it can be made unclean. So sex outside of marriage, homosexual acts, intercourse with animals, all those wrong sexual acts make it unclean. You have to distinguish between, say, clean sex and unclean sex. Sex in itself is not holy. It's created as clean. It can be made unclean. Or take food.
And that would be like with the animals.
Yeah, all animals
were clean, but the ones that we use for occult
purposes
became
unclean because of their use. And that made them unclean. Or say, for example, food. All food is clean. God made it as clean. He gave it for human beings to eat and drink. Wine is not unclean. Meat is not unclean, as many vegetarians, and people go into that. Doesn't mean you can be a vegetarian, but not for spiritual reasons. You can do it for health reasons. So meat in itself is not unclean. Alcohol in itself is not unclean. Even drugs in themselves are not unclean. But it's the wrong use of them. So, for example, any food that's been offered to an idol or pagan god is unclean. So distinguishing between what's clean and unclean, that's the one side. The other side is distinguishing what's holy and what's common. Common first of all, and I'll come back to that. So, for example, God created all food as being clean. It's common. Now, common means it's ordinary. It's for human beings in their life here on earth.
Yeah.
You have common food. So what's common food is meat and vegetables and fruit and bread. Common food. But anything that's common can be made holy. So you can have common food. So the bread and wine that you're going to drink for dinner tonight is common. But when it's been, when you say grace over it, becomes sanctified. It becomes holy. The bread and wine in Holy Communion is not common food, it's holy food. You have common and holy. Now, very often people confuse what's common with what's unclean. In itself, anything that is clean and is common. Before anything that's common can be made holy, it needs to be purified, cleansed. Let's say somebody's unclean. Before they can become holy, they have to be purified, cleansed. Something that's unclean needs to be made clean. Something that's common and unclean needs to be made cleansed, so it becomes common and clean before it can be holy and clean. And then the reverse. So if you can take anything that's holy and make it unholy, common, or by contact with what's unclean, you can make it defile it, make it unclean and desecrate it. So there's two forms of desecration. There's legitimate desecration, which is if God says, say, something that belongs to him can be taken and made common. So, for example, every firstborn male is holy to God. If God insisted that every firstborn male became a priest, then family life would be impossible. So the Israelites could redeem their firstborn sons by means of an animal or by means of paying some money, so that they ceased to be holy and they became common. So you distinguish those things from each other. But can I repeat then? The most important thing is that anything that's unclean is common. Okay? Common things can become unclean, and anything that belongs to the order of creation can become unclean. It can be either clean or unclean. But before it becomes holy, it has to be clean. Then once it becomes holy, it ceases to be common. Common means that it belongs to us, we can do as we please. Food that's offered to idols is unclean. But ordinary food that you eat is common and clean. The food that is we use in Holy Communion is clean and is holy. Now you could go backwards, say the bread and wine, Jesus' body and blood, is holy when it's part of the divine service. But it can be then become common when it's no longer part of the service. But you but then say people who are into the occult can use wafers and wine and break into churches to get wafers and wine
And use them.
for occult purposes.
Mhm.
Then it becomes unclean
Yeah.
and unholy. And that's the worst form of desecration, is to take something that's most holy and to make it unclean. That's the way that works. In a sense, that's the theological framework for the whole book.
Mhm.
In practical terms, it means that the Israelites, when they come into God's presence, need to be cleansed of impurity first before they can participate in the divine service.
Yeah.
If they participate in the divine service, they share in God's holiness and they share in the blessings that God gives them. And they are holy, and they live as holy people in their ordinary everyday lives. And since they are holy people, they have to make sure that they don't break any of the 10 Commandments by which they become unclean.
Mm. Well, just going on there, connecting this with communion, as you said, people must be made clean before they can participate in the holy.
Yes.
There's, with Christians, when we were non-Christians, we're unclean.
Yes.
So we must be first cleansed through baptism before
Yes.
we can participate in
Holy Communion.
Holy Communion.
Absolutely, because the basic rule for admission to Holy Communion is that you need to be baptised. But anybody who's in the state of mortal sin
Mm-hmm.
needs to be purified
Then
through confession and absolution before he can participate in Holy Communion without desecrating the body and blood of Jesus. Yes, you see that works there.
Yeah.
Right. Or say, for example, we speak about holy matrimony.
Yep.
Marriage in itself and sex in itself is not holy.
Mm-hmm.
It's common.
Yeah.
Now, let's say somebody's been involved in the wrong sexual practices.
Yep.
Say if I've committed adultery. Before my marriage can be sanctified, I need to be cleansed of my impurity. If I'm clean and if my marriage then is consecrated by the word of God and prayer, then it becomes holy matrimony. But it can go in reverse. Holy matrimony can be defiled and desecrated. It can be made unclean by my adultery. So it helps us to make sense of a lot of things in married life, and you can see this whole theology and the power of it most clearly in the sexual area, I think. But I'd like to tie this up now with just the reference to 4 different statements in Leviticus.
Yep.
The first is most important. 5 times God says, I, the Lord your God, am holy. So God introduces himself and commits, I, the Lord, he gives his holy name, he introduces himself by name, he commits himself to his people, your God, am holy. So they have a holy God. Holiness is not just something God does, but it has to do with his nature, his being. He is holy, and that means that nothing else is intrinsically holy apart from God. God alone is holy. Again, we hear that in the Bible, and all holiness comes from God. He makes everybody and everything else holy. So he is holy, and he's the source of holiness. Secondly, he calls his people to be holy. He says, you shall be holy as I, the Lord your God, am holy. Mm-hmm. Notice it's you plural. You, my people, shall be holy. Now, it's interesting in Hebrew that this can be taken in 3 ways.
Okay.
First of all, it's a command.
Mm-hmm.
You shall be holy. You must be holy. This is what God wants of you. Mm-hmm. You must not just do holy things, but be holy people. It's a command, but it's also a promise. Hebrew doesn't distinguish between you shall and you will. It's a promise. He promises to make us holy. We don't make ourselves holy. God makes us holy. And thirdly, and this is because the Hebrew tense doesn't distinguish between present and future, it can be also translated as you are holy because I, the Lord your God, am holy. So it's a statement of fact. And if I can work backwards, this is the way to take it. So he tells everybody who belongs to Israel, everybody who belongs to the church, you are holy. Not because you've made yourself holy, because I, the Lord your God, am holy. You are holy, and he says you will be holy. That's the promise. And then it's also our vocation. This is what we are to be like God in sharing his holiness. So you have God introduces himself as holy. He calls his people to be holy and promises to make them holy. And then the most remarkable statement is 7 times in the book of Leviticus. You have the formula of sanctification. God says, I am the Lord who sanctifies you. Notice the present tense there. I am the Lord your God, the one sanctifying you. So God is the one who sanctifies the priests, the offerings, and the people. They don't make themselves holy. God makes them holy, and you have a present participle because it's ongoing. What does God do all the time to his people? He makes them holy. He keeps them holy, and he makes and keeps them holy through their participation in the divine service. And because he makes and keeps them holy, they have to make sure they do nothing to desecrate and defile their holiness. The same thing applies in the New Testament. Jesus is the one who sanctifies us. We are holy, we are saints in Jesus. Mm-hmm. Jesus is our sanctification. We don't make ourselves holy. Jesus is the one who's holy. He shares his holiness with us. Mm-hmm. He makes and keeps us holy. And that means then that we share in the life of God, we share in the blessings of God, we live as in God's presence. Remember how the service of communion begins. Mm-hmm. Do you promise, there's a question there before you have the absolution, do you promise to live as in God's presence and lead a holy life even as Christ has made you holy? Christ made you holy, you live in God's presence, now lead a holy life. Mm-hmm. That sums up the book of Leviticus and its relevance for us.
Well, thank you for coming on today. I hope the listeners out there have enjoyed this episode, and until next time, I've been your host. Goodbye and God bless.